Hey you! Stop right there. We know who you are. You think you can smuggle drugs through this airport? Empty your bags now or you're going straight to jail. The officer's voices dripped with arrogance, their words slicing through the crowded terminal like daggers. Travelers froze mid-step. Suitcases rolled to a halt. A family paused, clutching their children closer. Eyes darted toward the scene unfolding in front of the security checkpoint. Two uniformed officers, faces hardened with prejudice, blocked the path of a tall black man in a tailored suit. Their stance carried authority, but their tone carried something darker: assumption, accusation, and bias. What the world didn't yet know, not even the bystanders capturing the moment on their phones, was that in less than 3 minutes, these very same officers would be the ones begging for forgiveness, for mercy, and for the chance to erase what had just happened. But fate doesn't offer rewinds, only lessons. The airport pulsed with its usual rhythm, a blend of voices layered over announcements, the hum of escalators, the steady drag of suitcase wheels across polished floors. It was international, diverse, a place where every face told a story. Yet for all its global presence, prejudice still found a way to slither through the cracks. Dr. Elijah Brooks walked calmly through the terminal. His steps were unhurried, purposeful, his tailored suit falling neatly across his broad frame. His posture carried quiet dignity, the kind of bearing earned through years of service, leadership, and resilience. To most passers-by, he was simply another traveler, distinguished, professional, unremarkable in the bustle of departing flights. But to officers Kane and Miller, posted near the security checkpoint, his skin color and confident stride were enough to trigger suspicion. Their eyes narrowed, their whispers sharpened. Kane, low muttering, "Look at him. Thinks he's above the rules." Miller smirked. "Bet he's hiding something. I've seen the type." They didn't have a type. They had a bias, one that had been rehearsed in silence for years, waiting for the next victim to step into its shadow. And so, with all the false authority of men who believed they could not be challenged, they stepped into his path. Kane, barking, "You there, stop!" Passengers nearby slowed their steps. A woman clutched her boarding pass tighter, watching. A businessman adjusted his tie nervously, not wanting to be pulled into the spectacle. But eyes couldn't look away. Elijah paused, his brow furrowing, his voice calm and measured, barely rose above the hum of the crowd. "Elijah, is there a problem, officer?" Problem. That was the word Kane and Miller had been waiting for. They didn't need evidence. They didn't need a reason. His existence was enough. Miller stepped forward, finger pointing aggressively. "Miller, don't play smart with us. We know who you are. Empty your bags right now or you're going straight to jail." The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Elijah's bag was yanked from his shoulder before he could react. Kane tore open the zipper with unnecessary force, pulling out neatly folded clothes, documents, toiletries, tossing them carelessly to the ground. Kane, mocking, "Where's the stash, huh? You think you can outsmart us?" Miller added, smirking, "You people always think you're slick." The venom in those words didn't go unnoticed. A young woman recording on her phone gasped softly. An older man shook his head, muttering to himself, "This isn't right." But no one stepped forward. Elijah stood still, his fists clenched discreetly at his sides. Anger boiled in him, but so did restraint. He had lived long enough to know that one wrong word, one wrong gesture, could escalate this from humiliation to tragedy. The humiliation was already public enough. His belongings, his personal life, were scattered across the floor like garbage for strangers to gawk at. Inside, Elijah's thoughts churned. Not again. Not here. Not when I've spent my life fighting for the dignity they now deny me. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Some passengers murmured in support of Elijah. Others averted their gaze, too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. Yet almost all had their phones raised now, capturing every second. And then came the words that shifted the entire air of the terminal. Voice, off-screen, sharp, commanding. "What on earth do you think you're doing with my chief guest?" The crowd parted instinctively, shoes clicking against the tile. A line of uniformed security officials entered, followed by men in dark suits with earpieces. Their presence was like a wave crashing into still water. Immediate, undeniable, impossible to ignore. At their center walked the airport director himself, expression a mix of fury and urgency. His gaze landed not on Elijah, but on the officers, who suddenly stiffened like schoolboys caught in the act. The suspect they had been tearing down in front of hundreds of travelers was no ordinary man. He was Dr. Elijah Brooks, humanitarian, decorated veteran, and keynote speaker at the International Peace Conference scheduled just minutes away. The silence that fell wasn't just shock, it was the weight of realization crashing all at once. The officers' arrogance cracked as quickly as it had appeared. Their hands trembled, their voices faltered. Kane stammered, "Sir, we didn't," he looked. Director cutting him off. "You assumed. That's all you ever did." The crowd now saw the truth. Phones recorded every flicker of panic on the officers' faces. Murmurs turned to gasps. Someone whispered, "That's the keynote speaker." Another, "They just racially profiled him." Elijah stood silent, not triumphant, not vengeful, just steady. His dignity, though tested, had not been taken. His silence carried more power than their shouting ever had. And within the next 3 minutes, everything would change. If you'd like, I can move on to part 2, Rising Action, next 1,200 words, where the humiliation flips into revelation, the officers collapse, the director's rebuke, and the crowd realizing the scale of their mistake. The silence after the director's words was deafening. Kane and Miller, the once confident officers, looked as if the ground had vanished beneath their feet. Their authority, their bravado, it dissolved in an instant. Passengers who had been frozen in curiosity now leaned closer, whispering among themselves, their phones still raised. The truth was spreading like wildfire across the terminal. This wasn't just a routine stop gone wrong. This was racial profiling, laid bare in front of dozens of witnesses and countless cameras. The director stepped closer, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the tension. "Director, do you even realize what you've done?" Kane swallowed hard, his hand still clinging to Elijah's empty bag. Miller shifted uncomfortably, sweat beating at his temple. Kane stammering, "Sir, we thought," Director cutting in, furious, "You thought. That's the problem. You didn't see a traveler. You didn't see a distinguished guest. You saw a stereotype and you attacked it." The crowd murmured in agreement. A woman's voice rang out clearly. "We saw everything." Elijah, still standing tall amidst the wreckage of his belongings, finally lifted his eyes to meet the officers. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. His calmness was unsettling, more powerful than anger could ever be. He bent slowly, gathering his items from the ground, each fold of clothing carefully restored, each personal object returned to its rightful place. It was a quiet act of reclaiming his dignity, piece by piece. The cameras followed his every movement. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but carried to every corner of the hushed terminal. "Elijah, you didn't just search my bag. You searched my humanity, and you threw it on the floor." A ripple ran through the crowd. Some audibly gasped, others murmured in agreement. The officers lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze. Suddenly, the steady thrum of boots echoed across the marble floor. A unit of military personnel, uniformed, disciplined, unmistakably authoritative, marched into the terminal. At their head was a commanding officer, his medals catching the fluorescent light. The crowd parted once more, the ripple of awe undeniable. The military presence was not routine airport security, it was a personal escort. "Commander, Dr. Brooks, we're here to escort you to the peace conference. The delegates are waiting." The weight of those words crushed Kane and Miller even further. The man they had accused of being a criminal was not only innocent, he was someone entrusted with carrying messages of peace and justice to the world stage. The irony was suffocating. Kane's lips trembled. He dropped the bag back into Elijah's hands, stumbling over his words. "Kane, sir, we didn't know. Please forgive us. It was a misunderstanding." Miller stepped forward, his earlier smirk replaced with desperation. "Miller, Dr. Brooks, we were just following protocol. We didn't mean director exploding. Enough. You've embarrassed this airport, this city, and this country in front of the world. Do you think protocol excuses racism? The officers fell silent, their bodies shrinking under the weight of his words. They were exposed, completely stripped of authority, reduced to pleading men who could no longer hide behind badges. The cameras kept rolling. There would be no erasing this moment. The passengers, once passive observers, began to speak up. Traveler number one, I saw everything. They had no reason to stop him. Traveler number two, it's not the first time. They always target people who look like him. Traveler number three, holding up phone. This video's already online. The world's going to see what happened. The murmurs swelled into a wave of voices, a chorus of indignation that the officers couldn't silence. For once, the bystanders weren't just watching. They were participating, bearing witness, and demanding accountability. The commander gestured to escort Elijah out, but he raised a hand gently, signaling that he wasn't finished. He turned back toward the officers, men who had publicly tried to strip him of his dignity. Elijah calmly, you asked me to empty my bag, but you never asked who I am. You assumed the worst. And today, the world will see the cost of that assumption. His voice was heavy with both pain and wisdom. He looked at them not with hatred, but with a piercing disappointment. Elijah, I won't carry bitterness, but I will carry this memory, and so will you. The officers' faces crumbled. Kane's eyes glistened, though he tried to hide it. Miller's hands shook at his sides. The director turned to the commander. Director, take Dr. Brooks where he belongs, on that stage, not in this humiliation, and see to it these men are relieved of duty immediately. The commander nodded. The officers opened their mouths to protest, but the words died in their throats. There was nothing left to defend. As Elijah walked away, flanked by the military convoy, the crowd erupted, not in applause but in murmurs of awe, of shame, of awakening. The scene would soon explode beyond the walls of the airport. Videos would go viral. News anchors would replay it. Commentators would dissect it. And the question would echo across the globe. How many others, without titles or protection, had suffered the same fate unseen? As Elijah disappeared beyond the terminal doors, Kane and Miller stood frozen, stripped of the power they had wielded so carelessly minutes before. The crowd's eyes burned into them, judgment unrelenting. The director's final words lingered in the air like a sentence passed. Director, you thought you stopped a suspect, but you stopped a symbol, and symbols cannot be chained by your prejudice. The storm had only begun, and for Kane and Miller, the consequences would stretch far beyond this terminal. The Grand Hall of the International Peace Conference was alive with anticipation. Flags from dozens of nations hung overhead, each symbolizing a fragile hope for unity. Delegates filled the rows, reporters packed the back, and cameras lined the stage, broadcasting to millions across the globe. But there was a hush in the air, a restless murmur of curiosity. Word had already leaked from the airport. Clips of the racial profiling incident were circulating online, flooding social media with outrage. By the time Elijah Brooks stepped onto the stage, escorted by the very convoy that had saved him from humiliation, half the world already knew what had happened, and the other half was about to hear it from his own lips. Before Elijah even spoke, giant screens displayed headlines pulled from live feeds. Racist officers humiliate peace delegate at airport. Renowned humanitarians stopped for flying while black. World watching as racism meets justice in real time. Clips replayed on loop, Kane barking at Elijah to empty his bag, Miller smirking while tossing his belongings to the ground. The moment the airport director stormed in, Elijah's quiet, piercing words, "You didn't just search my bag, you searched my humanity." The footage was raw, undeniable, and deeply human. The hall buzzed with discomfort, shame, and a collective anticipation of what Elijah would say next. Elijah stood at the podium, his tall frame radiating a calm authority. He didn't begin with notes. He didn't even acknowledge the formalities. Instead, he began with the truth. Elijah, 3 hours ago, before arriving here, I was stopped in an airport terminal. Not for what I carried, but for who I am. The silence was immediate, complete. Cameras zoomed closer. Delegates leaned in. Elijah. Two officers decided I fit the image of a criminal. They searched me, humiliated me in front of dozens of witnesses. They saw a black man in a suit and assumed guilt. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the hall. Elijah. But what they didn't see was a soldier who bled for his country. They didn't see the humanitarian who rebuilt villages in war zones. They didn't see the man chosen to stand here today before all of you to speak of peace. They only saw their prejudice. And in doing so, they didn't just strip me of dignity, they stripped themselves of justice. The hall erupted into murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras flashing. Elijah lifted his hand, silencing the room again. Elijah, this isn't about me. I had a director to step in, a military convoy to stand at my side, cameras to bear witness. But how many others suffer the same injustice in silence? How many are dragged away, unseen, unheard, forgotten, because they did not have a stage or a title or the world watching? A heavy stillness fell. His words carried beyond the walls of the hall, transmitted to millions watching live, searing themselves into the conscience of a global audience. Meanwhile, at the airport, Kane and Miller sat in a stark office, their badges and guns placed on the table before them. The internal affairs officer across the desk didn't even try to mask his disdain. Officer, you two humiliated a decorated veteran, a world leader, on camera. This isn't just misconduct, it's international shame. Kane tried to speak, his voice brittle. Kane, we thought we were protecting security. Officer cutting in. No, you were protecting your prejudice. And now you've not only lost your jobs, you've become the faces of everything we're trying to fight against. The weight of those words crushed them. Miller dropped his head into his hands. Kane stared at the wall, pale, hollow, the reality of his downfall finally sinking in. On social media, hashtags trended worldwide. # justice for Elijah. Hashtag flying while black. # peace, not prejudice. Clips of the incident garnered millions of views within hours. Protests erupted outside airports in major cities, calling for accountability, training, and reform. Celebrities, leaders, and activists condemned the officer's actions, amplifying Elijah's words. You didn't just search my bag, you searched my humanity. What had begun as an act of humiliation became a spark that ignited global conversation. Elijah leaned closer to the microphone, his voice steady, but filled with unshakable conviction. Elijah, I was humiliated today, yes, but I am not broken, because dignity is not something you can strip away with a badge or a uniform. It lives here. He placed a hand over his heart. And here, he pointed toward the audience. His eyes swept across the hall, piercing every corner. Elijah, justice does not begin in the courtroom. It begins in moments like these, when we decide whether to act with courage or with cowardice. Those officers chose cowardice, but I choose grace. Not for them, but for those still unseen, still unheard, still suffering. If my humiliation today can bring light to their darkness, then I count it as a victory. The hall erupted in applause, thunderous and unrelenting. Delegates stood, clapping. Reporters rose to their feet. The ovation rolled like waves, not just in the hall, but across living rooms, newsrooms, and smartphones worldwide. Back in the small office, Kane and Miller watched the broadcast on a muted screen. The image of Elijah, powerful and composed, filled the television. The applause roared through the speakers, though they didn't need sound to understand it. Miller whispered hoarsely, almost to himself. Miller, he could have destroyed us. Right here, right now, and instead, he forgave. Kane sat frozen, his jaw tight, his pride shattered. He knew this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. The humiliation he inflicted had been returned tenfold, not by vengeance, but by a man's refusal to stoop to his level. As the applause continued, Elijah lifted his hand once more, quieting the room. His final words cut deeper than any punishment, echoing across every screen. Elijah, remember this, injustice thrives in silence, but dignity, once spoken, can never be silenced. And with that, he stepped away from the podium. The climax was complete. The humiliation had been transformed into a beacon. The officer's arrogance had crumbled into ashes, and the world, for a moment, stood face to face with its own reflection. The hall was still vibrating with energy long after Elijah left the podium. Delegates spoke in hushed tones, some shaken, some inspired, many visibly moved. Outside, journalists rushed to file breaking stories, their cameras capturing the historic moment that was already reshaping global conversation. Elijah walked backstage, where a small group awaited him: his advisor, a handful of fellow delegates, and the conference director. The director, normally composed, had tears in her eyes. "Director, you turned humiliation into history. Do you realize what you've just done?" Elijah, still breathing heavily, gave a weary smile. "Elijah, I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just refused to stay silent." By nightfall, the incident had become the headline across every major outlet. CNN: Humiliation at airport becomes global call for justice. BBC: Elijah Brooks, the man who turned racism into a rallying cry. Al Jazeera: From airport shame to world stage, one delegate's defiance against prejudice. Clips of Elijah's speech trended across platforms. His line, "You didn't just search my bag, you searched my humanity," was replayed, remixed, and quoted in 1,000 posts, turning into a global rallying cry. Within hours, protests sprang up in airports from New York to Johannesburg. Demonstrators held signs reading, "Flying while black is not a crime," and "Justice at 30,000 feet." Airline boards, airport authorities, and even government leaders were forced to respond, promising reviews of racial profiling policies, new oversight committees, and accountability measures. For the first time in years, systemic injustice wasn't just a headline, it was a movement. At the precinct, Kane and Miller faced the full brunt of their actions. A disciplinary board convened, the footage played for a panel of stern-faced officials. "Chairman, this isn't just misconduct. This is dereliction of duty, violation of civil rights, and international embarrassment. You have shamed not only your station, but your country." Kane tried to defend himself, his voice shaking. "Kane, we were doing our jobs." He looked suspicious. The chairman slammed his hand down. "Chairman, suspicious? A decorated officer, a delegate in full credentials? Number, what you saw wasn't suspicion. It was your own prejudice staring back at you." The verdict was swift. Both men were stripped of their positions, dishonorably dismissed, and placed under investigation for civil rights violations. Reporters hounded them outside the precinct. Once arrogant enforcers of power, they were now broken men, reduced to stammering under the weight of their own disgrace. Miller muttered to a microphone, "Miller, he gave us grace we didn't deserve, and we destroyed ourselves." Back at his hotel, Elijah finally had a moment alone. He sat by the window, the city lights glowing beneath him. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to feel the exhaustion. The humiliation from the airport still burned, but it had been transformed, like iron forged in fire. He opened a message on his phone. It was from a young man in Atlanta. "Mr. Brooks, I saw what happened to you. I've been stopped at airports 5 times this year. I thought nobody cared. Tonight, for the first time, I feel like my voice matters. Thank you." Elijah closed his eyes, a lump forming in his throat. That message, more than the applause or the headlines, was the reason he had spoken out. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. Kane and Miller requested a private meeting with Elijah before leaving the city. Against his advisor's protests, Elijah agreed. The room was tense when they entered. No uniforms this time, only the weight of shame on their shoulders. Kane's arrogance was gone. His eyes were red, his voice brittle. "Kane, we ruined ourselves that day. But worse, we tried to ruin you. And you gave us mercy instead of vengeance. I don't expect forgiveness, but I had to say it. I'm sorry." Elijah studied them, his silence stretching. Then he spoke softly. "Elijah, you didn't just humiliate me. You humiliated every man, woman, and child who looks like me, and you humiliated yourselves. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, but it can keep you from becoming prisoners of it. What you do next will decide if this is your end or your beginning. The officers left in silence, their heads bowed. It was not redemption, but it was a seed. Whether it grew or withered was up to them. Weeks later, policies began to shift. Training modules were rewritten. Oversight boards were established. Elijah's words were quoted in Senate hearings, corporate meetings, and classrooms. His humiliation had become a blueprint for change. But more than the systems, it was the people who changed. Travelers who had once stayed silent began filming, reporting, speaking out when they saw injustice. Ordinary citizens began standing for strangers. And everywhere, Elijah's voice echoed, "Justice does not begin in the courtroom. It begins in moments like these." Months later, Elijah returned to the same airport where it all began. This time, no one stopped him. Instead, a young officer at the security line recognized him and said softly, "Officer, sir, it's an honor. Because of you, we had to change everything. And I'm proud to say, we're better for it." Elijah gave a small, grateful smile. He walked through security, his dignity intact, his legacy growing with every step. As he looked back one last time, he whispered under his breath, not to the officers, not to the airport, but to the unseen millions who had been silenced before him. "Elijah, we are not invisible, not anymore." And with that, he stepped forward, not just into his flight, but into history. The sun was setting over Geneva's skyline as the annual Peace and Justice Conference convened again. The same grand hall, the same banners of unity and hope. But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was a quiet reverence, as though the walls themselves remembered the moment that had electrified the world a year before. Elijah Brooks, now carrying the weight of both scars and triumphs, was once again invited as keynote speaker. But this year, he wasn't introduced as a delegate or humanitarian. He was introduced as the man whose 3 minutes changed the world. The audience rose in a standing ovation before he had spoken a word. Elijah stood silently for a moment, letting the applause wash over him, then raised a hand for quiet. "Elijah, last year I stood before you after the most humiliating moment of my life. I was accused, searched, and shamed for nothing more than the color of my skin. Many expected me to fight back with anger. But I realized something that day. Anger punishes, but truth transforms. The officers who stopped me weren't just exposing me to the world. They were exposing themselves, their prejudice, their fear, their blindness. And in those 3 minutes, something powerful happened. They thought they were stripping me of dignity, but instead they revealed their own lack of it. And to all who watched, to every child who has ever been stopped, questioned, or silenced simply for existing, I say this: you are not invisible. You are not less. You carry the same dignity as any king, any president, any leader who walks this earth. Never forget that. The hall was utterly silent, every word ringing like a bell in the air. Some delegates wiped their eyes. Others nodded, holding their hands over their hearts. In the months that followed, Elijah's story became required reading in academies, police training manuals, and human rights courses worldwide. His 3 minutes that changed everything was studied not just as an account of racism, but as a case study in how personal dignity can confront systemic injustice without violence. Civil rights groups expanded their reach. Airports in over 20 countries implemented bias check systems, ensuring accountability. Elijah himself was asked to advise on global transport reform. But more than titles and positions, it was the letters from ordinary people that mattered most. A mother wrote, "Because of you, my son believes he can travel without fear." A young recruit confessed, "Your words made me want to be a different kind of officer." A teenager said, "I used to think my silence was safety. Now I know my voice is power." Months later, Elijah quietly visited the same airport where everything had happened. He walked through the concourse, unnoticed this time, but every sound, the wheels of luggage, the loudspeaker calls, carried echoes of that humiliating day. At the very gate where he had once been profiled, a mural now hung, a painting of diverse travelers holding hands beneath the words, "Justice travels with us." Elijah stopped, staring at it for a long moment. His reflection merged with the figures in the mural, a reminder that he was both one man and every man. One evening, a letter arrived at Elijah's home. No return address. Inside, a short message written in shaky handwriting. We will never undo what we did to you. But we've spent the last year trying to live as better men. We join community outreach programs, we speak in schools, and we tell young officers the truth, that prejudice destroys both the victim and the enforcer. You gave us grace we didn't deserve. Thank you for saving us from ourselves. It was unsigned, but Elijah knew who it was from. He set the letter down, his eyes wet with a quiet grief, not for the past, but for the wasted years these men had lived blind to their own humanity. And yet, he also felt hope. If even they could change, then maybe the world could too. The camera would close, not on a stage, not on applause, but on a simple act. Elijah, back at home, sat on his porch with a group of neighborhood children gathered around him. They asked him about his travels, about the people he'd met, and finally one boy raised his hand shyly. Boy, Mr. Elijah, when those men hurt you, were you scared? Elijah paused, his gaze lifting to the twilight sky. Then he nodded slowly. Elijah, yes, I was scared, but being scared doesn't mean being powerless. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand tall, even when your knees want to bend. And sometimes, just sometimes, that courage changes everything. The children's eyes glowed with wonder. The camera would pull back, Elijah's silhouette framed by the fading sun, his voice carrying into the night. In the span of 3 minutes, Elijah Brooks went from victim to voice, from humiliation to history. His story reminds us that justice isn't built in courts or governments alone. It's built in ordinary moments, in the courage to stand, in the grace to forgive, and in the belief that dignity belongs to us all. Because when prejudice tries to strip us bare, the truth is this: humanity always wears the final word. Fade to black.